one-horse open sleigh, o'er the fields we go, laughing all the way. Bells on bobtail.
In 1980, one of the biggest sitcoms on American television changed in a way viewers could feel before anyone explained it. Chrissy Snow was still on Three's Company, but suddenly she was not really in Three's Company. The door did not fly open. She did not bounce into the apartment with that innocent smile. She did not misunderstand Jack. She did not trade looks with Janet. She was somewhere else, alone, speaking through a telephone. For a sitcom built on three roommates trapped in the same room, that phone call was a warning siren? At first, it looked like a harmless story trick. Maybe Chrissy was visiting family. Maybe Suzanne Summers had scheduling trouble. Maybe the trio would be back together next week. But behind the laugh track, the show was bleeding. A salary fight had exploded. Producers were furious. But a star was being separated from the cast, and the most successful roommate comedy on television was about to prove that one missing person could change everything. This is not just the story of a phone call. It is the story of how Three's Company rose from a risky premise, became a ratings monster, survived cast changes, lost its original magic, and ended by turning Three into a crowd. When Three's Company premiered on ABC in 1977, it arrived with a premise that sounded almost too dangerous for prime time. Jack Tripper, a charming culinary student, is found asleep in a bathtub after a party. Janet Wood and Chrissy Snow need a new roommate. Jack needs a place to live. The apartment is perfect, except for one problem. Their landlord does not approve of a man living with two young women. So they tell him Jack is gay. And that lie became the engine of the whole series. The show was based on the British sitcom Man About the House, but the American version found its own rhythm quickly. It moved the chaos to Santa Monica, added bright California energy, and turned misunderstanding into a machine. Every episode had the same dangerous fuel. Someone heard the wrong sentence. Someone walked through the wrong door. Someone saw two people in the wrong position. Then Jack, Janet, and Chrissy had to lie faster than the truth could catch them. The humor was broad, physical, and full of innuendo. But the secret was chemistry. John Ritter made Jack Tripper unforgettable because he treated embarrassment like an Olympic sport. He could fall over furniture, twist his body, flash panic across his face, and somehow remain lovable. He was not just telling jokes. He was throwing himself into them. Joyce DeWitt gave the show its spine. Janet was practical, sharp, and often the only person in the apartment who seemed to notice how ridiculous everything was becoming. Without Janet, the chaos would have floated away. She grounded it, and Suzanne Summers gave the show its sparkle. Chrissy Snow was sweet, dizzy, trusting, and strangely confident in every wrong idea she had. She was not mean. She was not cynical. She was funny because she misunderstood the world with total sincerity. Together, they were not just three actors sharing scenes. They were a rhythm. Jack panicked. Janet corrected. Chrissy misheard. And the audience waited for the explosion. That rhythm made Three's Company one of television's great comfort shows. Viewers knew the apartment, the couch, the kitchen, the swinging door, the suspicious landlords, and the exact feeling of disaster arriving with a knock. At first, Stanley and Helen Roper were a huge part of that world. Norman Fell played Mr. Roper as a cheap, suspicious landlord who always thought Jack was hiding something. Audra Lindley played Mrs. Roper as lonely, sarcastic, and far more aware than her husband. Their marriage was its own sitcom inside the sitcom. Then the first big change happened. The Ropers left for their own spin-off. On paper, it made sense. They were popular. They had clear comic identities, but removing them also changed the apartment's pressure. To replace that pressure, Don Knotts arrived as Ralph Furley, the flashy new landlord. Furley was not Roper. He was nervous, vain, overdressed, and desperate to appear worldly. Don Knotts brought his own comic history from The Andy Griffith Show, and his timing gave the series fresh energy. This is important because Three's Company had already survived change before the Chrissy crisis. The audience had accepted a new landlord. The show had adjusted. The machine kept running. But replacing a landlord is different from damaging the central trio. The title promised three. The comedy depended on three. The fantasy was three young people building a strange little family under one roof. And by 1980, Suzanne Summers had become too famous to be treated like a replaceable part. Chrissy Snow was everywhere. She was on magazine covers. She had the catchphrases, the look, the voice, and the audience affection. John Ritter was the official center of the show, but Summers had become the breakout star. Then came the contract fight. Summers wanted a major raise. Reports have long described her asking for a jump from about $30,000 an episode to roughly $150,000, seeking pay closer to a top television star. Her husband and manager, Alan Hamel, was part of the negotiation. The producers and network refused. What happened next became one of the most famous punishments in sitcom history. Instead of simply writing Chrissy out immediately, the show kept her barely present. She was reduced to short appearances, filmed separately, often speaking by telephone from another location. That phone changed everything, because Three's Company was not a show about people calling each other. It was a show about bodies in the same space. Jack needed to trip near Janet. Chrissy needed to misunderstand a sentence while everyone else reacted. Furley needed to walk in at the worst possible moment. Comedy came from proximity. The phone destroyed proximity. It turned Chrissy from a roommate into a visitor, a voice, a reminder, a missing piece. Imagine being a fan watching that first strange phone scene. The theme song still promises warmth. The apartment is still bright. Jack is still frantic. Janet is still holding reality together. But Chrissy is not standing with them. She is isolated, separated by a prop that says more than the dialogue. The show wanted viewers to accept it as a plot explanation. But emotionally, it felt like evidence. Something had happened. Something ugly. And the laugh track could not hide the empty space. This is why the phone call matters. It was not the loudest moment in Three's Company. It was not the funniest. It was not a dramatic farewell. But it exposed the crack that fans were not supposed to see. Television works by illusion. We know actors are paid, sets are built, jokes are written, and contracts exist. But a great sitcom makes us forget the machinery. It makes the apartment feel real. Chrissy's phone calls made the machinery visible. Suddenly, the audience was not just watching Jack and Janet talk to Chrissy. They were watching producers solve a business problem on camera. That is dangerous. Once viewers notice the business, the fantasy weakens. Behind the scenes, the fallout was painful. Summers later said she was isolated and treated harshly after the dispute. Her relationship with Joyce DeWitt suffered. Her relationship with John Ritter also cooled for years. The cheerful trio America watched every week had become a workplace split by money, loyalty, and power. And that is the part fans never want to believe. Sitcoms sell friendship. Television sells family. But behind the camera, family can become business very fast. After Chrissy disappeared, Three's Company had to rebuild. The first attempt was Cindy Snow, Chrissy's cousin, played by Jenna Lee Harrison. Cindy kept part of the old formula alive. She was blonde, sweet, and clumsy, a physical comedy character who could crash into a room and cause accidental damage. But audiences knew what had happened. Cindy was not Chrissy. That does not mean the actress had no value. It means she was given one of the hardest jobs in television. Replace a beloved character while everyone is still angry about losing her. The show then shifted again with Terry Alden, played by Priscilla Barnes. Terry was different. She was a nurse, more mature, sharper, and less innocent than Chrissy or Cindy. That was probably smarter than trying to clone Chrissy forever. But it also confirmed that the original era was gone. Three's Company continued. It remained popular. John Ritter still delivered brilliant physical comedy. Joyce DeWitt still anchored The Apartment. Don Knotts still brought landlord chaos. Richard Klein's Larry Dallas kept sliding in with sleazy confidence and terrible advice. The show still had energy, but the original magic had changed. That is the key distinction. The phone call did not kill the series instantly. It killed the innocence of the series. Before the dispute, the audience could believe in The Apartment as a carefree fantasy. Afterward, every replacement reminded viewers that the fantasy had been broken by real-world conflict. And yet, the series kept finding ways to survive. That survival is part of why the story is fascinating. Three's Company was never a deep drama. It was not trying to be art house television. It was a farce factory. Its job was to deliver misunderstanding, sexual confusion, slammed doors, nervous landlords, mistaken identities, and Jack Tripper pretending his way through disaster. Because the formula was strong, it could survive blows that might have killed another show. But survival created another problem: repetition. After years of misunderstandings, the same engine that made Three's Company reliable began to trap it. Jack lied. Janet worried. A landlord misunderstood. A date arrived. A jealous boyfriend appeared. Someone hid in a bedroom. Someone heard half a sentence. Chaos erupted. The audience still laughed, but television was changing. See, by the early 1980s, the shock of the premise was no longer as shocking. A man living with two women did not feel as dangerous as it had in 1977. The show's once edgy sexual farce was becoming familiar. That meant the series needed new energy. Instead, it lost pieces. The Ropers were gone. Chrissy was gone. Cindy came and went. Terry arrived. The cast was still talented, but the show had become a series of repairs. Every repair worked for a while. None restored the original feeling. There was also Lana Shields, played by Ann Wedgeworth, introduced in Season 4 as an older woman aggressively interested in Jack. She could have changed the dynamic. Instead, the character faded out without becoming essential. That, too, showed the difficulty of expanding a show with such a tight central design. On Three's Company worked best when the triangle was clean. Jack, Janet, Chrissy, landlord pressure outside, Larry causing trouble nearby. Simple, fast, repeatable. But once the triangle changed, the series kept searching for balance. By the final season, the end was near, but the show did not simply stop. It transformed into a launchpad for another series. The final episodes introduced Vicky Bradford, Jack's new love interest, and her disapproving father, James Bradford. Janet prepared to marry Philip. Terry planned to move to Hawaii. The apartment that once held the entire premise began emptying out. That ending is more revealing than people realize. Three's Company did not conclude by restoring the trio. It concluded by dissolving it. Janet moved into marriage. Terry moved away. Jack moved toward Vicky, and the apartment stopped being the center of everyone's life. Then Jack continued into the spin-off Three's a Crowd. The title alone said everything. Three's Company had been about a group arrangement that created comic possibility. Three's a Crowd was about complication, obstruction, and a new life that never had the same spark. The spin-off lasted only one season. That does not make John Ritter any less brilliant. He remained one of television's finest physical comedians, but it proved what the original show had already taught us. Jack Tripper was essential, but Jack alone was not the entire spell. The spell was the triangle, and the triangle had been fractured years before the finale. That is why the phone call that destroyed Three's Company is not just a title. It is a symbol. It points to the moment when the show's central promise became visibly damaged. The promise was that three people belonged together in that apartment, even when everything went wrong. The phone call said one of them no longer belonged in the room. From there, everything became survival. To understand why audiences still care, you have to understand what Three's Company represented. It was silly, yes. It was full of double meanings and misunderstandings. Some jokes have aged awkwardly. Some assumptions belong clearly to the 1970s and early 1980s. But it also captured a fantasy of young adulthood, broke people, chosen roommates, romantic confusion, cheap rent, bad decisions, and friends who somehow stay together through chaos. That is why the apartment mattered. It was not just a set. It was a little world. See, when Jack pushed through that kitchen door, when Janet raised an eyebrow, when Chrissy tilted her head in confusion, viewers knew exactly where they were. The place felt safe because the chaos was predictable. The phone calls interrupted that safety. They reminded viewers that outside the apartment, there were executives, contracts, negotiations, punishments, and careers being redirected. Suzanne Summers eventually reinvented herself. After Three's Company, she became a Las Vegas performer, author, businesswoman, and television personality. Her later success made the story more complicated. She was not simply destroyed by the dispute, but she was pushed out of one of television's biggest shows at the moment she was most visible. Joyce DeWitt stayed through the entire series. But for years, she was tied to a show whose happiest image had been disrupted. John Ritter moved forward, carried the finale, led the spin-off, and built a respected career beyond Jack Tripper. Don Knotts gave the later years a comic legend's energy. Priscilla Barnes gave Terry a sharper identity. The series did not collapse overnight because too much talent remained. But talent cannot fully replace timing. And timing was what the original trio had. The tragedy is that the show's greatest strength became the thing it could not repair. Three's Company convinced viewers that Jack, Janet, and Chrissy belonged together. Then business made sure they did not. That is why the phone call still feels cold. It was not written like a tragedy, but it plays like one if you know the backstory. See, a woman who had been central to the show now appeared briefly, separately, almost like a guest haunting her own sitcom. She was there just enough to remind you she was missing. That is worse than a clean goodbye. A clean goodbye lets the audience mourn. The phone calls made the audience pretend nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Everyone could feel it. By the time Three's Company ended in 1984, the series had given television 8 seasons, 172 episodes, 2 spin-offs, unforgettable characters, and one of the catchiest theme songs ever attached to a sitcom. It had made John Ritter a star, made Suzanne Summers an icon, gave Joyce DeWitt a permanent place in TV history, and kept farce alive for a mass American audience. It deserved its success. But its legacy is split in two. There is the bright version. Come and knock on our door. Laughter, beach energy, pratfalls, roommates, and misunderstandings. Then there is the shadow version. Contract battles, resentment, replacement, and the image of Chrissy Snow calling from somewhere else because the real Suzanne Summers was no longer welcome in the room the same way. Both versions are true. That is what makes the story powerful. Three's Company was not destroyed by one phone call in a literal sense. The ratings did not vanish overnight. The show did not end immediately. Fans still watched. New characters arrived. The machine kept producing laughs. But television history is not only measured by cancellation dates. Sometimes a show dies emotionally before it dies officially. Sometimes the audience keeps watching while quietly understanding that the thing they loved has already changed. Sometimes the most important scene is not the biggest one. It is the scene that reveals what can never be put back. For Three's Company, that scene was Chrissy on the phone. Not because the phone itself was dramatic, because it showed distance where there used to be chemistry. It showed absence where there used to be rhythm. It showed business where there used to be fantasy. And once viewers saw that, they could never completely unsee it. So no, the phone call did not erase Three's Company. It did something more haunting. It turned the show into a before and after story. Before the call, it was Jack, Janet, and Chrissy against the world. After the call, it was a sitcom trying to laugh around an empty chair. The show survived. The laughter continued. The theme song still played. But the original promise had been broken. The Three's Company began as a joke about a man pretending to be something he was not, so he could stay in an apartment. In the end, the show itself was pretending. Pretending the trio was still intact. Pretending the absence was temporary. Pretending a business war could be hidden inside a comedy scene. But fans know when a room feels different. They know when a rhythm is gone. They know when the laughter is covering a wound. And that is why, decades later, the phone call still matters. Because Three's Company was built on misunderstandings. But this time, the audience understood perfectly. Chrissy Snow had not just left the apartment. She had taken the original magic with her. And no matter how many doors slammed afterward, no matter how many jokes landed, no matter how many replacements arrived, that empty space kept ringing. If once that sound entered the apartment, the series could never pretend its heart was untouched again for anyone watching closely.